Well, welcome all. The clock has formally struck. We are here for a conversation on leading with practical wisdom and navigating self and the world. It's a conversation with our own Atiya Singh, who is an instructor here at the Graham School and a wonderful leader at the university more broadly. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. It is a gorgeous early spring day, which means cold, but sunny and getting greener. And this is the place where the big ideas are born that shape the world and that inspire incredible instruction, as you're going to hear about in a moment. We are, for those who are not familiar, the place for lifelong learning at the University of Chicago. We have been for more than 130 years, looking across great books, a catalog that includes all of the disciplines in the university, and advanced leadership for people that are thinking about really meaningful next chapters. For those who want to continue to learn with us, we have many exciting events in the month ahead. We'll be talking with David Brooks next week about discerning purpose in life's second half. We will have an info session for our 4-year Great Books program, and we're going to be talking with author Sahil Bloom about what he calls the 5 types of wealth. And as might be suggested by the 5, only one of them is financial, and the argument is there are 4 others that are actually more valuable that you should be thinking about in your portfolios. And with that, I'm going to take down my screen because you are here to hear from Atiya. And so let me add a spotlight for her. Atiya, we are thrilled to have you here with us. And let me just give a formal introduction. Atiya Singh is the director of the McKeon Center at the University of Chicago. Her teaching at UChicago spans disciplines and has won many awards. She is a former leadership development mentor at the Booth School. She is also someone who has taught in our basic program of liberal education for adults, and she has a PhD from the University of Chicago. Her recent scholarship and teaching has focused on the intersection of liberal arts and leadership studies, which is a perfect segue into our conversation. And so, Atiya, to get us started, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what sparked your interest in designing this seminar and exploring the relationship between wisdom and leadership that will be the core of the week-long program that you'll be leading here in May.
Well, thank you, Seth, and welcome everybody. Thank you for the warm introduction. I am really looking forward to teaching this course, and there are, I will say, 3 things that really inspired my interest in formulating this course. One is the idea of leadership, and I believe, and I suppose you will also agree with me, that there's a certain crisis of leadership that we encounter on somewhat daily basis, whether it's leadership in higher education, or whether it is in corporate America, or it is simply global politics. There is something that is happening, and it's not a good thing that is happening. And that actually sparked my curiosity about how do we make sense of our leaders? Do they navigate the world with wisdom? Does wisdom have a role to play in the way leaders are leading us and our institutions? So that's one. And second, I'm really excited to explore an integrative approach in this course, or interdisciplinary, because there will be a study of a philosophical text by Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics. And there is also another text that comes from psychology by Daniel Goleman called Emotional Intelligence, Whether It Matters More Than IQ. And seemingly they seem really at the opposite spectrum, but it is actually the notion of wisdom and the notion of self, the notion of leaders that kind of brings these texts in a really interesting conversation. So I would like to explore that. And thirdly is the practical aspect of the course. For Aristotle, especially, philosophy and moral philosophy was practical. one should be able to live philosophically. One should be able to live a life that is informed by wisdom, that one can actually practice wisdom. And so, to honor that idea, I also have included some practical activities and reflective activities in the course that would allow students to really explore and go deep into the notion of leadership, discover their own style, and also what is it and what is not that they appreciate about leadership. So this is a set of concerns that sparks my interest in the course.
Well, so I want to pick up on the second of those sparks and this spectrum that you describe that we may seem as broad, but may actually have real relationship between the Aristotelian vision for a good life outlined in Nicomachean Ethics and then Goleman's ideas. And so maybe we can walk through each of those because I know they're core to the
Yes.
seminar. And so let's start, and I know we're with a lot of people that have probably read this text by Aristotle, but can you talk about the Aristotelian vision for a good life, maybe review for some and new for others?
Of course, yeah. Let me review both texts and
Sure.
talk to some similarities and differences. So Nicomachean Ethics is a text in which Aristotle really is exploring the broad idea of how to lead a good life, how to lead a life that is ethical. And he does that by centering on the category of practical wisdom, because he thought practical wisdom is something that one can learn, one can cultivate. And one can do so by actually learning about virtues and develop certain virtuous characteristics, or moral characteristics. So he goes in some depth talking about virtues, and some of those are courage, honesty, generosity. And he warns us, he warns us that too much of everything is actually bad. So too much of courage, for instance, can lead to recklessness. So what he's trying to do there is that one should actually strike a balance, or what he calls a median. And so, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. And so until and unless these behaviors become habitual, they are just your regular habit, you cannot really develop practical wisdom. So in order to do that, one has to develop these habits. And so when Aristotle had students who came to study with him and with others at his academy, it was assumed that they already had these moral characteristics. They had a really strong moral compass, and what they needed to learn was how to enact it and how to put these ideas into practice, how to put wisdom into practice so that they could live a political life. And I think that is central to Aristotle. And when they can live a political life and a good life, they were ready to become leaders. So for Athens, it was important to have leaders who are educated in philosophy, who can not only practice contemplative philosophy, but practical philosophy. And so that raises really interesting questions for us, that is it possible for us to live up to Aristotelian ideals of practical wisdom that actually, may pose different challenges in our modern life? And that's where I think Daniel Goleman provides an interesting counterpoint, or or maybe a juxtaposition, I would say, in that Goldman is suggesting that maybe some kind of self-mastery over our emotions can actually allow us to live a life that is pleasurable, that is balanced, and that we may call wise, or, be led by wisdom. And so that's where I wonder if wisdom has a different name for our modern sensibilities. Shall we call it emotional intelligence? Is wisdom just a form of knowledge? Because for Aristotle, it is. Like, he does believe that rationality comes naturally to people. Everybody is rational, and they want to enhance that by developing aspects of practical wisdom. But is that so straightforward for us? And that remains a question. And I think that's where Goldman really speaks to our modern sensibility. And I think would be interesting to see how these texts are both in conversation with one another and also kind of expanding the horizons of our notion of wisdom and leadership.
And I know less about Goldman's work, but
Mhm.
it strikes me that one way sometimes that we manage our emotions
Yeah.
is by forming and, really disciplining ourselves around habits. That
Hmm.
it's a way of, ritualizing maybe,
Hmm.
the emotional approach that we want to take in. Is that something that you see as a potential connection point between the two, or do you see them as necessarily in tension between, a knowledge-based vision that is kind of relying on philosophy and almost a self-discipline or self-discovery vision?
Hmm. I think it is a bit of both for Goldman because he does think that emotional intelligence is a skill. It is a skill that can be adopted, that can be learned. Emotions can be educated. So there's a really interesting discussion, and that is in direct communication with Aristotle. So Aristotle has a discussion about anger. And he has this, and I'm paraphrasing this quote that Goldman directly quotes from Aristotle, which is that it is easy to become angry. But is it easy to be angry at the right time with the right person for the right purpose?
Mhm.
And that's where Goldman thinks, yes, we may be able to control our anger if we know what triggers us, if
Mhm.
we know the context in which we kind of lose control of ourselves and get angry. And so there is a way to actually teach ourselves by reflecting on those situations and learning lessons from those situations. And so it is, so it is really about creating a degree of self-awareness. And Goldman does go into that as well as Aristotle, yes.
So you've given us an incredible intellectual architecture for the course and the two main, protagonists as authors that we're going to be diving
Yes.
into. You mentioned in your third spark that
Mhm.
you wanted to help people apply these
Mhm.
liberal arts philosophies to their lives and leadership. And so I'm curious if you could talk a bit more about, I think this makes a lot of sense now in theory, right? Like I understand the Aristotelian idea of a good life.
Yeah.
But that is not immediately how I live every day, even though I would
Yes.
love to have that as
Mhm.
my virtue.
Mhm.
So talk a little bit about how do you take this from the text into
Mhm.
your life, and how do you
Mhm.
see helping people to translate these philosophies into practical leadership skills?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think it is a challenge to translate our ideas into action, especially because if we do not set some intentions for ourselves, and if we are not consciously aware of enacting some ideas, making improvements. And it is precisely for that a reason I thought I would ask the students to develop their leadership essay. And as the term essay suggests, I mean, in French, it means to try, to attempt. And for like when I did some leadership courses and I had to write my essay, I found it an extremely daunting experience. I had no idea what I should be writing about. I did not know who I was, what I would like to be, what kind of a leader would I want to be, how to lead my even personal life. I had no clue. Although I was living an okay life, but I was in no shape or form able to pen ideas and reflect. So I have developed certain prompts for each day in the context of our readings, and students will have time to reflect and write their thoughts. They can also collaborate with others. I think it's exceedingly helpful to articulate your ideas and your vision to others because you get feedback. And as you are speaking, you are also clarifying your ideas. So it allows for a certain engagement, which I think is very meaningful and very powerful. And so that is the practical aspect, that they would write this essay. We are also going to do some other stuff in the course, but they're going to develop this essay. It would be their journey of self-discovery, and in the end, they're going to present some of it, part of it, or all of it to their cohort. So I think we're going to put reflection in some practice to understand these ideas and wrestle even with ourselves and our notions.
Well, we're going to come to questions in the chat momentarily. So for those who have questions, please chat them in, or we also have an intimate group. You can also just use the React tab at the bottom of your screens and raise your hand, and we can come to you to ask directly. I have a couple questions before we get there, Atiya.
Yes.
Can you walk us through, you've already mentioned, each day there's this
Mhm.
prompt. Just walk us through what the learning experience looks like over the course of the week and
Yeah.
kind of how you're going to focus on the text and then these personal discovery moments and then some of the other opportunities that take place
Yeah.
in the seminar.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's an intensive week of learning. So the mornings are dedicated to reading the text, discussing them, and raising lots of questions, uh, with the idea that the morning sessions are going to inform the reflective sessions in the afternoons. So every afternoon, while students are going to work on their leadership essay, there are some days when actually we will have guest speakers who will come and talk about leadership examples and leadership work from real world experiences. So I think that's going to be really interesting. I can share this. Like one day we're going to talk about empathy from both psychological perspective and philosophical perspective. And I'm hoping that somebody would come and talk to us, because it's a theme that is very much talked about in workplaces and in leadership studies. And it's a theme, and it's a practice or habit or skill which is very, very hard. I find it very hard. It's a very challenging task. So we're going to unpack that in a setting with somebody else. Also, I know that I have planned a visit to the Smart Museum to view their special collection, only because I think leadership and wisdom, they require some kind of a holistic development. And I cannot speak highly of the arts. I think art is a great way to learn not only about ourselves, but also about the world and how we connect with others, how we talk to others, how we listen to others, our empathy for others. So I'm hoping that it's a session in kind of exploring our own sensibilities. So there is a mix of things in this course, and I would say there are different moments of intensity and then release and energy and reflection. Um, so yeah, I think it will be a good mix, and it will be really fun.
So can I ask you, Atiya, how has your own leadership changed in studying this and in trying to apply these concepts? And I know you've taught this as well at Booth, where you
Yes.
helped leaders who are coming from the perspective of being either future or, in the executive education case, current business executives. Can you talk a little bit about your own journey and then maybe how you've coached others?
Mm, yes. I think if I were to talk about my own journey, and well, I see myself as a product of the University of Chicago, and where I think I became an adult. I came into my own, and I when I taught these texts and I engaged with the philosophy of life and the philosophy of the mind, it really allowed me to get in touch with my inner self. So I would say that reading these texts have really helped me develop a certain degree of self-awareness, which I think is really important, not just in life, but in becoming a leader, in leading organizations. And that is something that I emphasized again and again when I worked with MBA students and especially in business settings, in organizational work. It is too easy to be critical and judgmental of others, uh, but it helps when you know how you are and how you behave and what you are about. It also helps you to connect with others, to understand others. So I think self-awareness was one thing that I had to learn, and it takes a long time to develop that. It's a hard skill, but it's a worthwhile skill. So that's what I emphasize in my work, working with others. And the other thing that I think is really important in leadership is the ability to work with others in a way that you are their mentor, guide, and their support, and you are also helping people, succeed in their goals. And that is something that I emphasize when I work with my students at Booth, as well as with other colleagues. I think it's really, especially working in teams, it's too easy to misunderstand things. It's too easy to react very quickly. And so I used to emphasize, and this is something I also have had to learn the hard way, is patience and,
Yeah.
like really controlling your reactions. It's too easy to react, but once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you cannot pull it back in. So, it's, I think, important to just kind of read the situation and not react.
Well, so we've begun to receive questions from our audience, and this person says, at the outset, you mentioned some leaders may not
Mhm.
fulfill Aristotle's vision. Can
Mhm.
you share an example of a modern leader who does embody practical wisdom in a way Aristotle and Goldman might admire?
Like contemporary
Well, why
life.
don't we give you freedom? Is there a leader
Oh, okay.
that you
Yeah.
see? We'll give you an opportunity to go into history if you need it.
Yeah. Okay,
Are,
great.
are there
Yes.
leaders who you feel like really embody the vision that,
Mhm.
you take away from these texts?
Yes, yes. So just about a week ago, I went on my American Odyssey, as it were. I went to Gettysburg and DC and then to Virginia. So basically, it really was an educational trip for our daughter to teach her about American history. And I was completely moved by the places we visited, and especially Gettysburg, which is where Lincoln gave
Lincoln,
his
yeah.
address, the Gettysburg Address. It was completely moving, really moving. And I think I really admire Lincoln. I admire Lincoln as our president. And I think he did have Aristotelian practical wisdom as well as Goldman's emotional intelligence. And really, it was about, when to make the decision, right? When to issue the Proclamation of Emancipation of Slavery. He could have done it before that moment, but he didn't because he was aware that it could result into bad consequences, into complete chaos. And so, he temporized his decision, for which he is criticized. But I think there was a reason behind it. And I think that's where his wisdom came into play, that, how to make a decision that is going to be effective and is really going to benefit society as a whole. So that's one. I admired Lincoln's model of leadership. And I think the second big figure was Thomas Jefferson on our visit. And I think, well, Jefferson is a figure of the Enlightenment. He himself, was a philosopher, and his work on the Declaration of Independence, of course, is a timeless text. And I think his leadership also would fit in the paradigm as laid out by Aristotle as well as Goldman.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we will have in a couple weeks one of the foremost scholars on Lincoln, Doris Kearns Goodwin, speaking with us on campus. And so,
Great, yeah.
I can put that in the chat for anyone who wants to go deeper into the practical ways that Lincoln may have embraced these values. We have more questions in the chat that I want to come to. We have a question from Timothy Lyman. Thomas Jefferson each month famously made a small list of character aspects to work on throughout his adult life. You've already mentioned Jefferson. I think at the very moment this was coming into the chat, is what Aristotle had in mind. Is this what Aristotle had in mind? And does anyone know if Jefferson was influenced in this practice by Aristotle? And so do you want to speak to that at all, Atiya,
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
Jefferson example?
Yes, actually, we went to Monticello and visited his house, of course, and his study. And his study was full of these books. You know, he of course read the Greeks, he read the Romans, and I think Aristotle, Plato, these were his favorite philosophers that he read many, many times. And I think if you've been to Monticello, you can see this in his life, the way he lived. You know, he gardened and he was a self-taught architect, and I don't know how much of a politician he was. I know that he was president, but I think more than politics, he lived a philosophical life. He was very in touch with the Enlightenment. He cultivated his friendships. He pursued his pleasures, you know, which is, as I mentioned, reading, I think, was his foremost habit and activity, something that gave him pleasure. I think gardening, he had many gardens, and he was an avid, person who kind of gardener, like, sowing seeds and planting, looking after his. And I think his other passion really was architecture, and it's remarkable the way he taught himself architecture, and he designed the University of Virginia, his own house. So I would say that Jefferson's example does come close to an Aristotelian life.
Great, and I will just mention, Timothy has corrected himself here to say it was Benjamin Franklin who made the monthly list to work on. So there may
Oh,
be
oh, you're right.
multiple
Yes.
founders who were inspired by aspects of great books culture.
Yes, Benjamin Franklin is one of my favorite persons. And I think especially when it comes to curiosity and how to lead a curious life, Benjamin Franklin is the only example I can think of, because he was so curious about everything about life, and figuring out how to do things. I mean, he was the first postmaster general, and he invented electricity, and and so yes. And I also saw somewhere his a page from his journal where he used to write, I must learn how to be patient, or I must learn how not to be angry. It was a very deliberate habit that he used to think about how to improve himself. I think that's what I was looking for. And it's really remarkable. There's something to learn from Franklin's life. I think we try to do that. Journaling is something that we talk about. And if we journal, I think it's a really good opportunity for self-reflection and to make improvements in our personhood, in our life. So,
You know, it's interesting when we think about these examples from the past. I'm
mhm,
struck when we're talking about the gardens and the, reading that these leaders engaged in, the different pace
mhm,
that it feels like life involved in the technology, obviously, that was
yes,
very delayed,
yeah.
in the nature of interaction.
Mhm.
And so one of the points you've made is that, you need to be able to manage your emotions. You need to use habit as a way to really build excellence in living your values. And yet we live in a very high pressure, fast paced world,
Mhm.
right? And so, how do you think about developing wisdom and the practices to cultivate practical wisdom in
Mhm.
a daily life that looks so different, where,
Mhm.
responses are expected to be immediate, communication is abundant,
Mhm.
and, you're expected as part of the operating environment to just be reactive at a pace that is beyond what usually allows for a contemplative life. I'm curious if you have thoughts
Yeah.
on, that disconnect between what you're describing as these are the keys for good ethical leadership, right? Being
Mhm.
contemplative, forming habits, and then this is the reality of a leader is, you mentioned higher ed. I have to respond to all of these, major concerns immediately from all of these different vantage points, or I need to be getting ready for all of these different
Mhm.
questions that are coming at this, intense upcoming. I'm curious if you just
Mhm.
want to talk a little bit about how you see these practically applying in a world that looks so different than the
Mm.
one that Aristotle occupied.
Great question. I think yes, that's absolutely right. Sometimes I wonder how would Aristotle live in our world? With all the apps and technology, how adept is he going to be in using these apps, and what would be his response? And I think in some ways, Aristotle, of course, did not live in a world that was so contradictory and so conflicting that there are these conflicting and competing interests involved. I think it would be fair to say that Aristotle's world was simpler than ours, as I think you are indicating. And so, yes, it is a challenge. I think it is a challenge to live a life that is more balanced, and in which we are not as distracted as we are today, or as we could be, because of the demands that are made on us by our workplaces, by our families. And I think it is possible to speak in Aristotle's register to get to a median, or what is an average or a mean, where one is not rushed and one is not constantly um, distracted or frazzled. And one can do this by setting certain goals and also disciplining others who are part of our lives. And that is, of course, our family, our children, our parents, and also our colleagues, our students. And it can be done, what, people like to say, setting some boundaries. It can be done intentionally by setting professional goals, workplace goals, and personal goals. At least that is what I have tried to do, so that I can, block some time to do my intellectual work. I like to read, I like to write, so I can do that. I can attend to my work, but if, my priorities may shift. And that's where I think the practice of living wisely, I think comes in handy. When you can actually respond to challenges and not um, be so exhausted or be so upset. It's all about how you're orienting yourself. And I think with practice, with reflection, one can find a way to center themselves. It's really a matter of how do you center yourself. And it's also about making choices.
Right.
We all make choices about what kind of work we want to do, what kind of gains we want to make on the basis of what we do, what is important to us. It is also a matter of where you are in your life. You know, when you're out of college, you have a different kind of energy and you want to try things. There are different concerns. When you are in your 30s, 40s, and 50s, it changes. And so I think it is a matter of awareness, like, okay, this point in my life, what is important to me. And so it is really about making choices and then making decisions that are good for you. So it's when it comes to those things like how to choose and how to decide, how to center yourself, and that's where Aristotle can be inspirational, and something to learn from him.
Jerry has a question. What is special about Aristotle's practical wisdom that is different from any other? And they, mention Lincoln Jefferson that you cited, but is there something that you feel is distinct about the practical wisdom that you would separate out from other leadership philosophies?
I think Aristotle, in some ways, is a foundational figure. It is a very early articulation on practical wisdom that has inspired other philosophers and other thinkers who came after him. So it is interesting that Aristotle still speaks to us. And whenever you have to think about practical wisdom, you have to go through Aristotle because it was the very first articulation, or like a very early form of articulation on the subject. I think the interesting point for us would be that how it has changed. How does and why does Aristotle continue to inspire us? And in what ways has that notion of practical wisdom evolved or transformed? So should I be reading Aristotle to learn about practical wisdom, or could I get that from somewhere else? And I think that depends on who you are. What is it that speaks to you? To some, I think when I've read Nicomachean Ethics several times, and each time I read it, I love it. I enjoy it. But maybe other people will find some other thinker like Daniel Goleman, or like there are many psychologists now who have talked about living a good life. So they may turn to those texts. Like Daniel Goleman, for instance, is very relatable. His accounts are full of stories and clinical studies of people like us. We immediately bond with them, because they're very close to our sensibility. But even Daniel Goleman invokes Aristotle, right? So it's like, for instance, like I'll give you another example of, so for instance, my daughter, she's learning to play the cello, and now she's learning some pieces by Bach, and she doesn't enjoy Bach. And I said to her, well, as a cellist, you have to go through Bach. There's just no way, So in some ways, Aristotle is like that. Like one has to go through him, and you may, come out at a different end, and you may have different ideas. But it is really important, I think, to process these big ideas, to see where we might land and what our insights might be. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, we have another question here that asks, what are some of the structural forces that you think make it less likely to have leaders that are in Aristotle's model? So you mentioned at the outset, one spark for you is that when you look across leadership, we have a gap between what is described in philosophy as valued practical wisdom and leadership, and then what we're seeing in reality. And I think there's a shared sense that gap is getting greater. And yet
Yeah.
at the same time, that's not necessarily that we don't have talented people or that, this is impossible, but there are factors that are probably making that type of leadership more difficult. I mean, we talked about one, the pace of change and the dynamism that technology
Hmm.
has brought. Are there others that you see
Hmm.
that may be reshaping the environment in which leadership takes place?
Yes, I think, well, I'm also an educator, and I think to some extent it does have to do with education and with learning. And, to my disappointment sometimes, I feel like in college and in graduate studies, sometimes there's a lot of emphasis on skilling, and which is fine. I think it's important to learn certain skills, but when they come at the expense of learning and knowledge, I think there's a problem. I think that's what creates the gap. So I feel like there is a real gap between what is theory and what is practice. And for some reason, the pendulum has swung in favor of practice or skills. And a lot of the times, those skills are taught or transmitted, in workshop settings or in different kinds of trainings, but they're really not informed by a framework which is provocative or philosophical or theoretical. So I feel like that gap between the two realms has um, widened a lot. And instead of one informing the other, it's just one that we value, and that is because I understand, there are real anxieties about careers, and there are real anxieties about getting jobs, and so you have to develop certain skills, and so I feel like there's an overemphasis in that direction,
Yeah.
which does come at a cost. So when these students, like students who are graduating from college, when they're stepping in the workforce, and if they don't have a very good educational framework and a learning mindset, then I think there are these challenges that they are unable to navigate. And oftentimes they fail. There's so many studies about how young college graduates are struggling in their workplaces because they don't know how to communicate, they don't know how to relate to their colleagues, they don't show up on time, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are just several studies that one reads in kind of business review types of work. So I think maybe there that's there it's this that's causing some kind of a crisis in leadership. But also, I think our context is remarkably complicated than what was during Aristotle's time. There are just so many contradictions, and if we don't spend time understanding the world and understanding these complexities, it is really hard then to solve these problems and to navigate these problems. And I think in some ways, our leaders have lost their way. That, their kind of theoretical insights are not in sync with their practice. So that's kind of my observation. That's
Yeah.
my sense.
Thank you. And I'll just mention David Brooks, who's a adjunct faculty member here at the Graham School, like you, has written quite a bit about the role of higher education in particular in the kind of privatization
Yeah.
of resources. And, there's kind of private skill development, you might call it, how do I advance my career? There's maybe public school development. How do I become a more meaningful contributor to democracy
Mhm,
how the role of education has kind of
mhm.
had less and less in the moral formation and citizenship formation
That's right.
and more in that private benefit direction, including a cover piece in the Atlantic a couple months ago. So
Yes.
you're pointing to, anyway, something that another Graham community member has
Mhm,
identified and written quite a bit about. I know we are at time nearly. I'm curious if you could just talk about what you hope people will take away from the seminar if they come and
mhm,
participate in it. What would be your goal for how people will grow
mhm,
intellectually and personally through
mhm,
this experience?
mhm. I think it will allow people to wrestle with some ideas. And at the end of the course, I'm hoping that they will take certain, they will be able to develop certain practices that contribute to their own self-awareness and also their ability to, teach others from their learnings how to lead not just their personal lives, but also, to be in the world and to lead others, to work with others, and assume some kind of social responsibility, as you were saying, how to be a good member of society, because that was Aristotle's point, how do you become a useful and a good citizen in society? And so my hope is that students are able to develop that sense to some extent and take it to other places and when they work with others and mingle with others.
Well, this has been a fabulous conversation, Atiya. Thank you for bringing this seminar to our learning community, and thank you for helping us to rediscover a very important point of how we develop as people. I mean, I think, one of the things we can be doing in education is we can be bringing these texts and asking people to reflect on them and creating an opportunity, in our case, later in life, for people to really form these values. And to the point you made, you're going to read this differently with, decades of experience. And it might refresh your sense of how you want to live an ethical life. And I think that many of these things are dominoes in both directions, right? When you see people around you who want to embrace these types of values and want to think deeply about and examine life of purpose, that can be very inspirational. And in some ways, we've been in a little bit of a vicious cycle in terms of, feeling as if these values are hollow because we don't see them role modeled. And so then we internalize that. And so,
Yeah,
courses
that's right.
like this and others where we're taking these books seriously and we're each coming to our own vision for what it looks like to live an ethical life. I think just that experience itself is a virtuous cycle in the sense that you begin to see people seriously treating these issues, and that in its own right is a way for us to realize and normalize that an
Mhm.
examined life of purpose is a really important part of being a citizen. So I thank you for being part of that process and for teaching at the school. And I look forward to hearing all about the experience that our learners have in your seminar this May.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. And thank you to everyone for attending the conversation. I hope it was useful.
I'm sure it was, and thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.